The shrill announcements over the airport speakers barely pierced the fog in my mind. I stood frozen near the gate, a single suitcase at my side, watching them disappear down the moving walkway with a precision that made my chest ache. My son and daughter-in-law moved with that cruel efficiency, heads held high, eyes forward, oblivious to the wreckage they had left in their wake. Each step echoed in my skull like the crack of a whip, the sound magnifying years of trust shattered in an instant. The crowd around me became a blur of indifference, the rolling trolleys and footsteps fading into an abstract haze. No one seemed to notice the gravity of the scene, and yet every fiber of my being felt exposed, humiliated, alone. If I could shout, scream, even lunge, would it change anything? Or was this public betrayal a premeditated exhibition, orchestrated so flawlessly that I could not even protest? The weight of the deed I had signed pressed on me, a silent confession in ink and paper, binding me in ways I hadn't understood until this moment. My pulse thumped like a drumbeat of anger, grief, and disbelief, each beat a reminder that naivety had its cost. I remembered Sunday dinners when laughter filled the house, the smell of my favorite spices in the kitchen, quiet evenings when trust felt natural, unquestioned. And now, all of that warmth had been stripped away, replaced with the cold efficiency of their departure. The metallic clink of my suitcase wheels on the tile sounded obscene, a mocking accompaniment to the storm inside me. My hands trembled, not with weakness but with a surge of calculated rage that whispered, "This is not the end. Not yet." I replayed the moments leading here, dissecting every conversation, every smile, every casual remark I had once dismissed. Had I ignored the signs? The quiet glances exchanged across the dinner table, the sudden urgency in whispered phone calls, the subtle shifting of alliances I hadn't noticed until now. They all pointed toward something I could neither ignore nor forgive. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, conspiring silently against me. Around me, travelers moved with the obliviousness of the innocent, their indifference a stark contrast to the knife of betrayal lodged in my chest. I pressed my palm to the handle of my suitcase, the leather smooth beneath my fingers, and I realized that even in my paralysis, a quiet resolve was forming. I would not let humiliation define me. I would not be the passive victim in this meticulously staged theater of family deceit. My eyes followed them, the distance between us growing, yet the heat of indignation only intensified. I felt the clash of memory and reality, images of shared holidays, the warmth of a hand held in trust, conversations that seemed trivial at the time but now were riddled with hidden meanings. Each recollection cut like shards of glass, and yet beneath the pain a spark of calculation flared. I began to trace the threads of their audacity, wondering what invisible hand had guided their actions. Was it just cruelty? Or had the patterns been set long ago, subtly nudged into existence through complacency, distraction, and the blindfold of my own trust? My mind, frantic yet precise, cataloged every detail, replayed every conversation, analyzed every gesture. CFX distant airport announcement. Flight 302 boarding at Gate 7. A mundane voice, yet it reverberated against my inner chaos. How could life continue around me as if nothing had happened? The world felt both alien and cruelly mundane. I walked toward the terminal exit, my steps hesitant, the polished floor reflecting a fractured version of myself. The glare of overhead lights struck the floor like spotlights on my own public disgrace. Around me, strangers brushed past, their hurried movements oblivious to the storm of betrayal and confusion I carried. My hands tightened around the suitcase handle, knuckles white, heart hammering. A thought, sharp and cold, flickered. They will not get away with this. They underestimated the fire they ignited. I imagined following them, observing, cataloging, noting every slip, every subtle sign of guilt or overconfidence. The airport, once a space of departure and reunion, had transformed into a landscape of psychological warfare. Each corridor a potential battlefield for revelations yet unseen. I paused by the large glass windows overlooking the tarmac. Planes taxied in measured lines, engines roaring, metal beasts carrying passengers to unknown destinies. I thought of the family I had trusted, now moving purposefully through space, oblivious to the human cost of their audacity. The scent of polished floors and airport coffee mingled with the phantom memories of home, of comfort, of laughter, now twisted into a cruel joke. I felt the first true pangs of clarity. This was not only betrayal, it was a test, a challenge, and a summons to awaken a part of myself I had neglected. My grief, raw and jagged, merged with cold calculation, forming a lattice of strategy, patience, and impending confrontation. I realized that the humiliation I endured here, in this impersonal terminal, would be the crucible forging my response. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower, filtered through tall windows, slicing through the space in jagged beams of light. I imagined the path they had taken, each step recorded in my mind, each glance and gesture interpreted and catalogued. The emotional tempest raged inside me, alternating between heartbreak and a growing sense of control. The act of being left, abandoned publicly, exposed to the judgmentless world, transformed into fuel. Each memory, each slight, each betrayal became a coordinate on an invisible map of retaliation and revelation. And still, I restrained myself, aware that patience, not impulsive anger, would yield power. The first step was understanding, the second observing, the third carefully orchestrating exposure. I clutched my suitcase, stepping into the corridor leading toward the parking lot. The hum of travelers faded behind me as the echo of my own heartbeat became loud and deliberate, a metronome for the internal reckoning taking shape. I replayed the scene one last time. The glance from my son, the poised composure of my daughter-in-law, the indifferent bustle of bystanders, all witnesses to an event that seared itself into memory. A quiet, unyielding thought settled in my mind. I will reclaim what was taken. I will navigate the shadows they have left me in, and I will emerge, not broken but sharper, wiser, and relentless. The tension between vulnerability and strategy coalesced, shaping the man I needed to become, both wounded and vigilant, heart heavy but mind precise. The final boarding call echoed distantly, almost mocking. I fixed my gaze on the moving walkway where they had disappeared, chest tight, hands trembling slightly. Not with weakness, but with the intensity of a mind awakening to a path of calculated action. Around me, life flowed, indifferent and unyielding, and yet I felt the pulse of possibility. The promise that every misstep they made, every hidden alliance, every overconfidence could be leveraged. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of humiliation settle into a quiet steeliness, and as I turned toward the shadowed corridor leading out, I knew this was only the beginning. The first embers of a storm fueled by grief, betrayal, and incipient vengeance burned deep. My eyes followed the last fading glimpse of them, and in that charged silence, I understood. The reckoning was inevitable, and the stage had been set. The door clicked softly behind me, a mundane sound that suddenly felt like the seal of a trap. I stepped into the house I had once known as sanctuary, and yet every corner seemed alien, every shadow a potential spy. The familiar smell of polished wood and lingering perfume now carried a subtle edge of treachery, a reminder that nothing could be taken at face value. My eyes scanned the room, settling on the photographs lined along the mantel. Faces I had trusted for years stared back, smiles frozen in time, now tainted with suspicion. Each image seemed to whisper, "Not everyone here is who you think they are." My chest tightened as I ran a trembling hand over a framed picture of family laughter. A scene once warm, now frigid under the icy scrutiny of betrayal. I began retracing the past weeks, each conversation replaying in my mind like a film on endless loop. The daughter-in-law's seemingly casual remarks, the way she glanced at my son when she thought I wasn't watching, even the neighbors' hesitations, all now read like cryptic messages pointing toward something orchestrated. Each recollection sharpened the blade of suspicion. My heart wavered between anger and disbelief, the sting of humiliation mixing with the gnawing recognition that I had been blind, or perhaps too trusting. I sat at the kitchen table, notes and receipts scattered before me, tracing patterns like a detective chasing shadows. Each line of text, each scribbled date, felt laden with hidden meaning. I paused, heart hammering, wondering how much of life had been staged before my eyes, how much of trust was a convenient illusion. Parsing, could someone truly manipulate every facet of my daily existence without me seeing it? The weight of unanswered questions pressed against my skull as I sifted through old letters, their paper brittle yet still carrying the faint scent of ink and intent. The words once mundane now appeared coded, deliberate. Was that casual phrase a hint? That hurried signature a concealed admission? Each subtle inconsistency pulled me deeper, twisting the knife of self-recrimination. Why had I not noticed the signs? Why had comfort lulled me into complacency while the groundwork for this betrayal was laid so meticulously around me? The realization that naivety could be weaponized struck with cold clarity, and I clenched my fists, nails digging into palms, grounding myself against the tide of rising panic and strategic calculation. Around me, the house held its breath, shadows stretching along walls like silent witnesses to a conspiracy that had been fermenting just out of sight. Night settled like a shroud over the rooms, and with it came restless memories. I recalled small moments now tinged with hidden meaning, whispered phone calls behind closed doors, furtive exchanges across the living room, absences explained with the flimsiest of excuses. Each recollection was a fragment of a larger puzzle, and yet the full picture remained obscured by the haze of deception. Sleep eluded me as I wandered from room to room, inspecting letters, receipts, and documents as though they might confess the truth aloud. My footsteps were careful, deliberate, almost reverent, as if disturbing the pattern could alert unseen observers. The air was thick with both fear and determination, a cocktail that sharpened every sense. I could hear the faint creak of the old floorboards, the whisper of wind against the window panes, each sound magnified into portent. Hours stretched, the clock indifferent to my vigil. I traced the trajectory of each clue, each hint of collusion, mapping connections between faces, places, and times. The daughter-in-law's friends emerged as potential nodes of influence, each glance exchanged, each hesitation in conversation, a thread in an invisible web. My mind oscillated between rage and cold calculation, torn between the desire for immediate confrontation and the necessity of understanding the full scope before making a move. I questioned the integrity of every familiar person, the neighbor, who always smiled too broadly, the friend whose laughter felt strained, even my son whose silence now seemed like complicity rather than restraint. The line between ally and adversary blurred with every passing hour. The living room, once a place of warmth, now felt like a stage for secrets. I knelt beside the rug where my footsteps disturbed a layer of dust, and something caught my eye. A slight irregularity, a fold beneath the fibers. Heart racing, I lifted it carefully and discovered a small hidden note, its edges worn, the ink partially smudged. The signature was incomplete, but enough to ignite recognition and suspicion. A chill ran down my spine. Allies in the shadows. The betrayal was deeper, more orchestrated than I had imagined. I held the note, fingertips trembling, mind spinning with implications. Whoever had placed it there wanted it discovered. Or perhaps it was a careless mistake, a sign of overconfidence. Either way, the revelation demanded action, demanded that I plan my next steps with precision and caution. I sank back against the couch, eyes fixed on the note, letting the gravity of the discovery wash over me. Memories of trust and betrayal collided violently within my chest, a storm I had no intention of ignoring. The house itself seemed complicit, its walls echoing with whispered secrets, corners bending toward me with silent accusation. My pulse quickened as I imagined the network of deception, the hidden observers, the silent alliances, the unnoticed manipulations that had set this trap. I realized that my understanding of family, of loyalty, had been fundamentally altered. The people I had loved most were now potential threats in a game I hadn't known I was playing. Minutes, maybe hours, passed indistinguishable in the weight of contemplation. I began cataloging what I knew, constructing a lattice of suspicion and strategy. Each detail was a node in a map that would guide my decisions, which conversations to provoke, which hesitations to note, which alliances to test. Anger flared, then settled into cold calculation. My vulnerability, humiliation, grief, confusion, became fuel for strategy. I would not allow my naivety to dictate the outcome. Every movement, every observation, every whispered hint would be recorded and assessed. I was no longer simply a victim. I was a participant in a dangerous game of truth and deception, where the stakes were the very foundation of my life and family. The shadows lengthened further, crawling along the walls, transforming familiar rooms into corridors of suspicion. The documents before me, the scattered photographs, the hidden note beneath the rug, they all told a story of meticulous planning, of collusion that had gone unnoticed until now. I could almost feel the presence of those who had orchestrated this, their eyes on me, their confidence in their secrecy. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I traced the pattern of movements, imagined conversations, and considered motives. Each new realization sharpened my mind, forging a path through the emotional fog toward clarity and calculated action. I rose from the couch, moving silently to the window overlooking the street, the muted city lights casting fragmented reflections across the floor. The night was indifferent, alive with distant sounds of traffic, conversations, and unknowing passers-by. I could feel the hum of possibilities in the air. Every choice, every observation, every patient moment of waiting could tilt the balance in my favor. I pressed my palm to the cool glass, heart pounding, mind racing, and I understood. The network of betrayal extended farther than I had imagined, and to navigate it would require vigilance, patience, and unflinching resolve. My grief was not weakness. It was a compass pointing toward the truths that had been hidden in plain sight. The clock chimed softly, a reminder that time moved on even as I wrestled with the weight of discovery. My gaze returned to the rug, to the hidden note, to the scattered evidence that had transformed my home into a labyrinth of secrets. I clenched my fists, resolve hardening like steel in my veins. The daughter-in-law's audacity, the whispered alliances, the carefully concealed manipulations, they would not go unanswered. I would uncover every secret, expose every collusion, and reclaim not only my property, but my understanding of who could be trusted. And as the night deepened, a quiet, chilling thought settled in my mind. The people I had called family might not only be complicit, they might be the architects of my downfall. The weight of this realization pressed on me, heavy as the darkness outside, and yet within that pressure, a spark ignited, a spark of determination, of clarity, of cold, precise calculation. My hands hovered over the documents one last time, eyes scanning each detail, each pattern, each omission. The house was silent now, but in that silence, the story of betrayal, whispered insistently, demanding that I act, that I plan, that I survive. The hidden note beneath the rug, the partially visible signature. It was a summons, a warning, and a challenge all at once. And in that suspended, breathless moment, I knew the path forward would be treacherous, fraught with deception and danger, but unavoidable. The shadows of my home had become a battlefield, and I was both warrior and witness. The moment I closed the front door behind me, the house exhaled a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. Every room seemed to pulse with secrets, every shadow a witness to events I had only begun to comprehend. The daughter-in-law's audacity had not only bruised my pride, it had sparked a fire in me that was methodical, cold, and unrelenting. I placed my palm against the cool surface of the wooden banister, fingertips tracing its grain, and felt the weight of calculation settle into my bones. The living room, once familiar, now resembled a chessboard, each object a potential clue, each sound a subtle signal. My eyes darted from the muted sunlight through the blinds to the stack of letters on the side table, and I began the meticulous process of untangling a web spun so skillfully it had gone unnoticed until now. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the lingering perfume of someone whose confidence had once masked duplicity, a scent that now seemed almost predatory. I sank into the armchair by the window, and my mind raced. Each interaction from the past weeks replayed like film, gestures dissected frame by frame. My son's evasive looks, the half-smile that never reached his eyes, shifted from benign to suspicious. Friends' subtle reactions, the quiver of a voice when confronted with casual questions, now felt like breadcrumbs laid deliberately for my discovery. Even neighbors' knowing nods, previously dismissed as polite acknowledgement, now took on a sinister clarity. My pulse quickened, and I realized that vulnerability and calculation were not enemies. They were intertwined, necessary tools in navigating the treacherous labyrinth that had become my family. Grief, humiliation, and rage coalesced with strategic foresight, sharpening my mind into an instrument of scrutiny and patience. The documents on the coffee table drew my attention. Handwritten notes, receipts, records of phone calls and meetings, all seemingly mundane, yet they whispered of hidden motives and orchestrated deception. I traced each signature with a trembling finger, noting inconsistencies, the subtle hesitation in a pen stroke that betrayed thoughtfulness or concealment. My breath caught as the patterns began to emerge, conversations that overlapped, absences that coincided, explanations that contradicted themselves. The breadth of manipulation was staggering. I could feel the temperature of the room rise with the intensity of my focus, my heartbeat pounding like a drumbeat of silent vengeance. How had I been blind to these signals, so invested in the comfort of trust that I ignored the edges of dissonance? I rose and paced the room, each step deliberate, feeling the tension coil within me like a spring. The house seemed to respond, floorboards creaking under my weight, shadows stretching and recoiling as if acknowledging the presence of calculated intent. I paused at the staircase, peering down at the hallway below where whispers had once traveled unnoticed. The echoes of those murmurs now resonated with significance. I considered the timing of revelation. Who should be confronted first, who could be observed, and who would crumble if pressured too soon? Every decision carried risk. Each misstep could undo the careful advantage I had begun to cultivate. My vulnerability, shame, grief, and humiliation was now a shield, a strategic facade behind which cold calculation thrived. Hours slipped by unnoticed as I plotted, traced and retraced connections between gestures, documents, and conversations. The daughter-in-law's boldness, once infuriating in its simplicity, now required precision, a careful orchestration of response. I reviewed snippets of overheard remarks, mental notes from fleeting glances and subtle cues gleaned from the household's daily rhythm. Each insight layered over the last, building a map of internal alliances, hidden fears, and possible betrayals. My chest tightened with the weight of realization. The battlefield was far more expansive than I had imagined, and to miscalculate now could render the advantage I had fought to reclaim null. My hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the intensity of mental exertion, the electric hum of anticipation that precedes decisive action. The evening light dimmed, casting long stripes across the walls, elongating shadows that mirrored the network of hidden alliances I had uncovered. I gathered scattered papers, stacking them by significance, tracing patterns with both eyes and mind. Small victories emerged, an inconsistency in a friend's account, a hidden detail in a receipt, a fleeting hesitation overheard during a casual conversation. Each clue confirmed that my instincts had been correct. Betrayal had infiltrated the familiar spaces of my life, and yet the full scope was still partially obscured, tantalizing and infuriating in equal measure. I clenched my fists, nails biting into palms, and allowed the full spectrum of emotion, grief, rage, and wounded pride, to fuel the meticulous strategizing that now consumed me. My attention was drawn to the phone on the kitchen counter, a silent witness to hours of observation and reflection. Messages, some old and forgotten, some recent, flickered in memory, each hinting at manipulations beneath the surface. I replayed the conversations in my mind, isolating nuances, pauses, changes in tone, inflections that once seemed inconsequential now screamed of intentional misdirection. The interplay between the seen and unseen became a map, guiding my response, dictating the timing and method of revelation. I felt a surge of both dread and exhilaration. The thrill of comprehension mixed with the burden of knowing the stakes had escalated far beyond what I had anticipated. A sudden knock at the door jolted me, heart leaping as adrenaline coursed through veins like fire. I approached cautiously, scanning the hallway before cautiously lifting the latch. A letter slipped under the door with quiet precision lay waiting. Its presence was electric, an unspoken message that the internal battlefield of my family extended beyond what I had imagined. I bent to retrieve it, fingers trembling as the weight of anticipation settled over me. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words carefully chosen, yet the tone carried unmistakable warning. You are being observed, the game is far from over. My stomach churned, the room spinning with both fear and a grim sense of opportunity. Every strategy I had considered now demanded reassessment, every assumption challenged. I returned to the living room, letter in hand, the pages rustling softly in the quiet. I sat again in the armchair by the window, light from the street lamps casting long, fractured shadows across the floor. I read and reread the note, each line igniting both curiosity and dread. Who had sent it? Friend, enemy, or conspirator? The ambiguity stoked a fire in me, sharpening the edges of calculation, merging with the grief and humiliation that had seeded this journey. I traced the words with a fingertip, mind racing with possible interpretations, scenarios, and contingencies. The house seemed to contract around me, every familiar corner now imbued with the tension of anticipation. I understood with chilling clarity that patience, precision, and unflinching observation would determine the outcome. The night stretched on, each moment heavy with potential discovery. I cataloged the implications of the letter against the patterns I had already uncovered. Every observation, every documented inconsistency, every fleeting glance now demanded scrutiny. The daughter-in-law's network, her allies, the silences of my son and friends, all formed a web that required careful disentanglement. Vulnerability had given way to strategy. Grief had become a lens for perception. Humiliation had transformed into measured determination. I was no longer merely reacting to events. I was orchestrating, anticipating, and preparing for the confrontation that would inevitably test both my patience and resolve. Finally, I set the letter aside and allowed my gaze to sweep across the room. The quiet hum of the house mingled with the distant city sounds, yet the tension was palpable, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the storm I intended to unleash. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the knowledge that the path forward was fraught with peril, but navigable only through meticulous observation and precise, calculated action. My mind raced with contingencies, emotional stakes intertwining with tactical thought, each revelation a step closer to reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from me. And as I stared into the dimly lit room, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, I knew the family battlefield was set and the first move would define everything. The moment I stepped into the living room, the air seemed to thicken, dense with the ghosts of unspoken words and fractured trust. The walls, familiar yet hostile, reflected the tension like mirrors, amplifying the smallest tremor of my heartbeat. My son and daughter-in-law stood near the sofa, faces carefully composed but eyes betraying unease. The house, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a stage, every corner a witness to the drama I intended to unravel. I drew a slow breath, letting the weight of hours spent analyzing, calculating, and observing settle into deliberate patience. Today was not about reaction, it was about precision. Every gesture, every word would be measured, aimed to reveal the fractures they had tried to conceal. The scent of polished wood mixed with lingering perfume, a subtle reminder of domestic normalcy now tainted by manipulation. My gaze swept the room, noting the faint lines of tension in their posture, the slight hesitation in gestures that had once seemed casual. Each moment became a fulcrum upon which the balance of truth and deception teetered. I began softly, almost conversationally, yet every syllable carried intentional weight. I asked questions they had no choice but to acknowledge, probing the spaces where lies might hide. My son's eyes darted, avoiding direct contact, while the daughter-in-law's expression flickered. Pride and defiance momentarily betrayed by the twitch of a lip, the subtle narrowing of eyes. The silence that followed each question seemed heavier than the words themselves, a living presence in the room. I let each pause linger, allowing the tension to coil, to make them uncomfortable, to let the weight of scrutiny settle on their shoulders. My own pulse thrummed in my ears, yet my exterior remained composed, a mask of calculated calm. Inside, grief, rage, and wounded pride mingled with the icy clarity of strategy. Vulnerability was no longer a weakness, it was a lens, sharpening my perception, giving me insight into their hidden fears. Confessions surfaced slowly, like ripples across a dark pond. A slip here, a hesitation there, cracks forming in the carefully constructed facades. My mind cataloged each detail. The fleeting glance at the ceiling, a half-muttered excuse, the micro-expression that betrayed a suppressed gasp. I traced the trajectory of their deception, piecing together a timeline that now seemed undeniable. Whispers of manipulation, secret meetings, and casual affronts, details I had once overlooked, now hit with the force of accumulated betrayal. My chest tightened as the emotional intensity grew, each revelation a spark feeding the storm that churned within me. I felt the raw ache of recognition. The home I had built, the relationships I had nurtured had been weaponized against me. Yet amidst the sting of anger, a calculated resolve crystallized. Today I would reclaim control, expose the truth, and watch the cracks widen until the facade crumbled. I moved through the room with deliberate steps, closing the distance between observation and confrontation. My voice when I spoke was steady, measured, carrying both inquiry and subtle challenge. I watched reactions closely. The daughter-in-law's tightening grip on the armrest, my son's fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the sofa cushion. Each reaction confirmed my suspicions, yet also demanded further verification. I allowed myself a fleeting glance at the stack of documents on the table, reminders of hours spent tracing inconsistencies, reviewing records, and connecting fragmented dots. They were the map to the deceit that had enveloped my family, and now I held the power to illuminate every shadow, to bring the hidden into the harsh light of exposure. Memories surged as I pressed, both fuel and caution. I recalled moments of trust, shared laughter, and tenderness, all now tinged with the bitter knowledge of betrayal. Whispers that had once seemed insignificant now reverberated with weight, their implications undeniable. Each subtle slight, every strategic omission, formed a mosaic of manipulation so precise it bordered on artistry. I traced the contours of my anger and grief, letting each emotion inform my strategy rather than dictate reaction. Vulnerability and calculation danced together, intertwined in the execution of a plan honed over sleepless nights. My eyes locked on them, silently conveying the depth of observation and the inevitability of exposure. The crescendo built when a particularly damning piece of evidence emerged, a note discovered beneath a cushion, the handwriting unmistakable. I placed it on the coffee table between us, letting the gravity of its presence settle over the room. Silence stretched, taut and electrifying. My son's jaw tightened. The daughter-in-law's gaze flickered to the floor, and I felt the tension spike, a living thing pressing against the walls. I spoke then carefully, forcing acknowledgement of what had been hidden. The weight of the unspoken now demanded articulation, and as the truth began to unravel, I saw the first cracks of panic in their composure. Their reactions were raw, instinctive, denial, fleeting regret, the flicker of remorse. Each response was a testament to the accuracy of my deduction, yet also a reminder that full resolution would require patience, timing, and careful control. I allowed the room to breathe with the revelation, watching the subtle interplay of shock and strategy. The daughter-in-law shifted, a micro-expression betraying the ripple of guilt beneath her carefully constructed mask. My son's hands fidgeted, each gesture an unconscious acknowledgement of involvement or oversight. I traced the emotional landscape, noting where fear met defiance, where arrogance collided with vulnerability. My own emotions, intense yet disciplined, guided my engagement. Each word, each carefully placed pause was intended not to humiliate but to illuminate, to expose the architecture of betrayal without surrendering the moral ground I had fought to maintain. The air seemed to hum, heavy with the tension of revelation and anticipation of what would come next. A sudden admission, a confession that had been withheld, spilled into the charged atmosphere. The room seemed to tilt, the words hanging between us like a fulcrum of consequence. I felt the shock ripple through the walls, through the furniture, through every carefully maintained facade. Time slowed. Even the distant hum of the city beyond the window seemed to pause, acknowledging the seismic shift in our domestic universe. Their eyes widened in tandem, unguarded and raw as the full implications of their actions finally became undeniable. The confession was not complete absolution, but it destabilized the balance they had sought to maintain, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time, truly accountable. Even as the confession settled, lingering questions clung to the room, unspoken yet potent. What had been the extent of their orchestration? Were there allies I had yet to uncover? The suspense pressed into every corner, refusing to be ignored. I sensed the internal battleground extend beyond the immediate confrontation, into unseen spaces where strategy and loyalty continued to shift. My mind cataloged every response, every hesitation, and every moment of hesitation that might hint at further duplicity. The chapter, heavy with emotional beats and cinematic tension, closed on that precipice. Confession delivered, exposure enacted, yet full resolution still just out of reach. My pulse thrummed with anticipation, and the room, though quiet, remained charged with the promise of the final reckoning yet to come. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds, casting long, warm stripes across the floor, yet it could not soften the chill still coiled in my chest. The confrontation was over. The confessions had been made, the truth revealed, and the webs of manipulation laid bare. But the echoes lingered, vibrating through the walls, through the furniture, through my very bones. I stood alone now in the quiet of the home that had once been both a haven and a battlefield. Every corner seemed to hold a memory, a whisper of betrayal, a subtle trace of what had been lost. The air carried the faint scent of old letters, of ink mingled with dust, of the tangible residue of history. The intimate reminders that even in revelation, the past does not fully release its grip. My hands brushed across the polished wood of the dining table, tracing the edges where we had shared meals, laughter, and quiet conversations now forever tinged with the sharp sting of deceit. I could feel the weight of every decision I had made, the calculations and observations that had guided me through this labyrinth of treachery. I sank into the sofa, the cushions offering a fragile comfort as my mind revisited each revelation, each confession, each subtle slip that had forced the daughter-in-law, the son, and even distant allies into reluctant honesty. I felt the duality of my emotions pressing against me, relief mingled with grief, triumph softened by exhaustion, and the sharp, lingering edge of anger tempered by reflection. How easily trust could be manipulated, how readily familiarity could become a weapon. It struck me with a bitter clarity. Yet amid the tumult of betrayal, I also recognized the strength I had gained. Each sleepless night, each painstaking analysis of gestures and words, each moment of self-restraint had forged a clarity I had not possessed before. My grief, once a maelstrom threatening to consume me, had been transformed into insight. My rage, once a fire ready to burn indiscriminately, now tempered my judgment, and my vulnerability, once a mark of weakness, had become a lens through which truth was discerned. I allowed my gaze to wander over the room, noting subtle signs of aftermath. A photograph slightly askew, letters stacked with meticulous care, the faint indentation of a pen where a confession had been penned. I thought of the son's hesitations, the daughter-in-law's fleeting remorse, the quiet, imperceptible tremors of realization that had crossed the faces of those involved. They were human, imperfect, and yet accountable in a way that was undeniable once the veil had lifted. I reflected on the cost of trust, of naivety, of assuming loyalty without scrutiny, and I understood that my reckoning was not about punishment nor vindication alone, but about reclamation, reclaiming my narrative, my authority, and my capacity to navigate a family fractured by ambition and deceit. Sunlight shifted subtly through the blinds, brushing the floor with golden lines that felt like markers of time and memory. I picked up one of the old letters, letting my fingers linger over its textured surface. The ink, slightly faded, carried not only the words themselves but the resonance of countless small decisions, omissions, and gestures that had accumulated into the audacious betrayal I had endured. I thought of each moment I had retraced, each conversation revisited, each subtle look decoded, each whispered remark reconsidered. The labyrinth of manipulation had been formidable, yet through patience, observation, and the steady beat of reason tempered by emotion, I had navigated it. And now the path forward lay clearer, even if the scars remained. The quiet of the house was punctuated by small sounds, the soft creak of a floorboard as I shifted, the distant hum of traffic beyond the windows, the gentle rustle of curtains in a faint breeze. These everyday details, once unnoticed, now anchored me, providing a rhythm, a reminder of continuity, and the ordinary world that persisted even amid extraordinary betrayal. I moved deliberately through each room, noting both emptiness and presence. The spaces where confidences had been shared, the corners where secrets had lingered, and the surfaces that had absorbed tension without judgment. Every detail became both a record and a guide, shaping my understanding of what had been lost and what could still be salvaged. I allowed myself to sit in solitude, letting the residual tension ebb without rushing it. Reflection was not passive. It was active, deliberate, a means of reconciling grief with insight, vulnerability with strategic awareness. I traced the edges of my moral compass, examining where empathy could coexist with the cold assessment of human behavior. Forgiveness was no longer abstract. It was a conscious choice, not for them, but for me. Releasing the corrosive power of bitterness did not erase the betrayal, but it returned to me a measure of agency, of clarity, of resilience that could not be taken. Memories surfaced, vivid and sharp, shared laughter, tender moments, gestures of trust now reframed by the lens of experience. Each recollection was accompanied by reflection, by the awareness of patterns, of omissions, of the subtle art of manipulation that had almost succeeded in bending my perception. I felt a surge of gratitude for my own capacity to endure, to observe, and to act with both courage and deliberation. I recognized that my role was not only as witness or survivor, but as arbiter of my own choices, the custodian of moral and emotional authority that would guide future interactions, whether cautious or trusting. I rose to the window, letting sunlight wash over my face, warm and illuminating. The world outside continued, indifferent to the small universe of betrayal and reckoning within these walls. Yet within me, clarity had settled. I understood that justice, at its most potent, did not always require confrontation or retribution. Sometimes it required awareness, measured action, and the quiet assertion of personal integrity. The chaos had been confronted. The lies had been exposed. The balance of power, though shifted, was no longer obscured. Each breath I drew reinforced a sense of agency, each heartbeat an affirmation of vigilance and discernment. Even as I felt the weight of past deceptions ease, I knew the work of reflection was ongoing. Relationships once taken for granted would require careful negotiation. Trust, though shaken, was not irretrievably lost. It demanded scrutiny and patience, guided by lessons forged in hardship. I allowed myself small gestures of normalcy, the brewing of tea, the gentle curling of pages in a letter, the inhalation of sunlight and quiet. These rituals were not trivial. They were acts of reclaiming rhythm, of reasserting control, of affirming that life continues beyond betrayal and confrontation. As the day waned, shadows lengthened, stretching across the familiar rooms now reframed by awareness. I felt the enduring tension of human relationships, of choices made and consequences endured. Yet within that tension, a new strength emerged. Resilience tempered by insight, emotional depth aligned with strategic awareness, a clarity that was both hard-won and fully owned. I understood that the scars of deception would remain, but they no longer dictated my narrative. I had reclaimed my voice, my judgment, and my capacity to navigate a world where love and betrayal intertwine. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of quiet, standing amid the stillness, sunlight filtering across the floor, letters, and objects that bore witness to the past. The weight of the journey through grief, rage, calculation, and reflection rested lightly now, no longer a storm but a measured cadence guiding my steps forward. The chapter closed on a contemplative, empowering note, the cliffhanger subtle yet potent. The web of past betrayals may linger, but I remain vigilant, clear in purpose, and resolved to navigate the future with the wisdom earned from this reckoning.